So I'm Jason with More Handy, and I've just finished installing this extra closet rod in a laundry room. One of the problems that people have in the newer laundry rooms, especially with newer washers and dryers, is that with the height of the washer and dryer, it's hard to get a closet rod up above them that you can still reach and hang clothes on effectively. So we've gone ahead and added this closet rod here. Additionally, it gives you a nice bit of shelf storage space for laundry baskets. Really much of anything else you could possibly want to put up there that you don't need to access all the time. So if you're interested in building one of these for yourself, stick around and I'm going to take you step by step how I made this one. Let me just say up front that I'm not going to call out a whole lot of measurements during this process, mostly because this piece was built on the fly. The one measurement that you do need to be concerned about is that a closet rod should be between 12 and 14 inches away from the wall, and there should be about 2 inches above the closet rod so that you can easily get your clothes hangers over. For these wooden closet rods, I wouldn't go longer than about 48 inches. This entire unit was about 42 inches long. I guess with this build, I really wanted to bring the idea that you don't need a detailed schematic in order to build a nice woodworking project. Just follow a few basic guidelines and you can turn out a nice looking piece in under a day. I've started off by penciling in a few designs of what I thought might look the best, and I think I've settled on this one here, mostly for the simplicity and the fact that I think it'll go with the home more so than something like this. So now back to the original drawing. I've basically decided the top of this should be 14 inches, the height should be 12. Each one of these areas here should be 3 inches across, and then we'll figure out this radius by figuring out a center mark here from where these 2 points would have come together had this been a rectangular piece. Then of course we'll drill our hole for our closet rod. For now we want to transfer these marks onto the wood below. For the top of the shelf, I want the grain to run this direction. I just feel like it makes a stronger piece for when somebody's hanging clothes on this. The weight of clothes can add up fairly quickly. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and mark down 12 inches. And now I want to transfer that mark in 3 inches. Now this square can't reach a full 14 inches, so for this I'm going to go ahead and move over to the tape measure. And now I'll use the square to drop that mark down 3 inches. So now that I've laid out the 14-inch run for the top of the shelf and the 12-inch run for the bottom of the shelf, and I've measured in 3 inches from each of those, and I've placed a mark. Now I want to add the radius. It's going to connect those marks. But because it's not a perfect square, what I have is a situation where the radius would connect here, but not connect here. So what we're going to do is create the radius as though we were starting it here, but we're going to shift it this way just a little bit. I think all this will make more sense when you see it happening in action. So start it out just by cutting a piece of cardboard. I'm going to put a push pin right through. And then I'm going to put the pin exactly where that lower corner mark would be. At this point, I'm going to come up to where my pencil is and figure out where that mark is going to be. And that's going to be right here. So now I'm going to put a hole in the cardboard at that location. This hole will be for the pencil lead to pass through. Now with the push pin in place, you'll see that when I make the radius, it's not going to line up exactly as I wanted it to. As you can see, we've missed our mark over here by a pretty significant amount. So by putting this hole pencil lead where that mark should have ended and then shifting this piece over, I can now redraw the radius, and I've managed to connect the two. The only issue is I need to make this a flat line across the top. That's easy enough to do with a combination square. I'm going to erase some of these other lines just to avoid and remove some of the confusion about what I'm about to show you. It basically comes down to I have laid this out and I've created the radius, and now I'll know exactly where to follow with the jigsaw. When I cut, I'm going to try to stay just outside of this line. I'll come back later and I'll clean this line up with a belt sander, but you could also use a radius pattern template. Now with the first piece cut out, I'll lay it up top, line it up, and use it as a rough pattern to make the second one. And now I'll cut out this piece the same way. And now that both pieces are cut, I'll clamp these together and clean up this radius with a belt sander. Once I was happy with the results of my sanding, I'm going to go ahead and stick these two pieces together with some double-sided tape. That'll allow me to run a ball bearing router bit down the center mark of the two and help average them both out exactly. The problem with the belt sanding method is that the belt sander tends to leave a slightly uneven finish from one edge to the other. In other words, this will help me kind of even out the road. At this point, now that I've flipped and done both sides of this radius, I'm going to trim these edges to match exactly. And now I have two 100% identical pieces. So now I want to make some holes to receive this closet rod. This closet rod is 1 3/8 inches, and so I'll use a 1 3/8 inch Forstner bit. The benefit to a Forstner bit is that it leaves a flat bottom hole, perfect for this kind of application. A couple of things to consider when doing this is that the clothes hangers are going to need a little bit of space to reach over the closet rod and get in. So your closet rod needs to be as close to the bottom as possible, allowing for enough material at the bottom to give plenty of strength. It's a pretty easy thing to figure out. You can just place the Forstner bit about where you think you want it and place a mark. In this case, that gives me about a 1/2 inch of material between here and the bottom of this corbel. So now that I have that, I can give the Forstner bit a little tap, leaving a little point here so that I can set my tool and measure exactly how far that point is from the top. And I'll lock that in place. Now I'll flip it over and put a mark on the other side. Now I'm going to go back to the original side, and I need to figure out how far in from the edge that point was. So I'm going to loosen the combination square, and I'll set it to exactly that depth. Once I have it, I'll tighten it down, flip it over, and put a mark on this side. So now I know exactly where to drill with my Forstner bit on both sides. The biggest thing to be aware of in this situation is to not drill too far with the Forstner bit and to drill as much at a 90-degree angle as is possible. I could do this on the drill press, but I've done this enough times, I think I can be accurate enough to get the job done. As for how deep to go, that's largely going to depend on the material that you're using, but in this case, I was able to go the depth of the Forstner bit itself, and I think that's going to be perfect. Now I'll flip it over, do the same thing on this side. I think that does the trick. So at this point, I can go ahead and separate these. So now I need to go ahead and make the pieces that are going to serve as the crown to this piece here. The crown pieces do two things. One, they just add a nice detail to give it a nice look. They also give me the distance that I need above this closet rod to allow the clothes hanger to go over this without any issues. And they're just a little bit longer than the overall corbel. How long is not really important. All that really matters here is that they're longer because we're going to put a routed detail edge on this, and I want the detail to sit beyond the edge of this corbel. And now I want to add a little detail to the front of these corbel toppers, so I'm just going to put a mark at the 1/4 inch line on both sides. Then I'll take that to the miter saw and trim off these corners. So at this point, I've put in a 1/4 inch round over bit with a ball bearing, and I've set it for a partial depth, and I'm just going to round over all of the edges except for the back. Okay, so now that I have these completed, and they're going to go on pretty much something like this, what I want to do at this point is to go ahead and add a radius or some other sort of detail here. And since it'll be easier to just do a 45-degree angle, that's what I've decided to do. I'm just going to come in a 1/2 inch from the edge, put a mark, and I'll cut this at a 45-degree angle. So at this point, I have my 1/4 inch round over bit with a ball bearing, the same bit that I used to do the upper runners for these corbels. And I'm going to route the front edge, the radius, and the lower edge only on both sides. So at this point, I'm ready to go ahead and glue on this upper runner. The big things I'm looking for here is that it lines up in the front where the radius cut begins at the bottom, and that it lines up in the back where I've cut it off flush. Now I'll set this aside to dry. This piece here will serve as the top shelf for this unit. So what I want to do is go ahead and put a 45-degree angle on the two front corners to kind of match the 45-degree angles that we're going to have on the corbels themselves. So what I'm going to do is measure in 2 inches and put a mark. I'll measure down 2 inches and put a mark. Then I'll take the square and connect the dots. Now I'll take this over to the miter saw and cut off the 2 corners. And I've also gone ahead and cut some oak stripping to go ahead and cover the leading edge of the shelf all the way around, with the exception of the back. I want to start attaching these shelf pieces, so the first thing I want to do is to get this corner cut out and this corner attached. I'll do that at the miter saw by cutting this to length, measuring from the corner to corner on the inside of this angle. So in other words, from here to here at 22.5 degrees. So now I have the 22.5 degree cut made. I've placed this piece against the plywood shelf, and I'm going to mark this corner. So now I'll make this cut at 22.5 degrees as well. That's pretty good. So now I'll go ahead and just mark where to cut this piece off so that it will be flush with the back of the shelf. I'll go all the way around like this until I have the complete frame made up. And that takes care of gluing the frame around the shelf top itself. In this case here, this is not an optimal situation for clamping this up. But one of the conditions that I definitely don't suffer from is having too many clamps laying around. So I'm going to use this tape. Basically, wood glue is a lot stronger than you might imagine, and you'll probably end up tearing pieces of the plywood away before you pull this off. There really just won't be an issue with these pieces of wood being weak and falling off. So at this point, I've removed the top and I've sanded all the edges, as well as sanding on the corbels. I've gone ahead and placed them roughly where they're going to be, and that was just an arbitrary decision that I made. There was nothing specific there. And now I've centered both in the exact same location, and I've done that by using this combination square to make sure that they match both at the front and the back areas. And then I've done the same thing on the other side. So once I have them set and matched, then I'll just take a pencil and mark a line. We'll need that line later because I'm going to have to pull these up in order to glue the closet rod in place. So now I need to know how long to make the closet rod. So it's not enough to just measure inside edge to inside edge. I also have to know how far it goes into this hole. Again, I'll use the combination square. In this case, we're looking over just over 1/2 inch. And it's the same on this side. So now I can measure inside edge to inside edge and then add 1 inch to that. And with the closet rod cut, I'm going to go ahead and chamfer the edges just a little bit. That's just to help assist in getting the closet rod to fit inside the holes we cut. These holes are going to be pretty tight, and we're looking for a nice tight fit, but we don't want it to be impossible to shove in there. I feel pretty good about that. And now that I have that in place, I'm going to go ahead and place glue just on the inside of these lines, and I'm going to get these corbels and closet rod glued in place. The big thing here is to make sure that I'm aligning it with the line that we drew earlier. And now we'll just give that a little time to dry. And while that's drying, we'll go ahead and make our back piece. The back piece does 2 things. One, it pulls this shelf into a flat plane. It also gives us something to screw into when we're trying to screw this into the studs behind the wall. And the material that I'll be using for that is a 5 3/4 inch piece of 3/4 inch plywood. And with one end square, I'll set it down here toward the end, and I'll mark the other side. A quick test fit looks pretty good. But I want this to sit all the way flat against the cabinet. But that's going to be a problem where the corbels have come into contact with the top of the shelf. So what I'm going to do is notch out just this corner here to be able to go around this corbel. And I'll do that with a 45-degree cut on the miter saw, 1 inch in on both sides. And you can see that bevel does a pretty good job. So even with the bevel, I still have a gap here I'll need to close. And I want to close that by adding pocket screws to this component here on the back face. I want pocket screws to go from here into both corbels and into the top. So I'll drill those pocket screws with a pocket screw jig. Now since I already had the jig, I went ahead and drilled the pocket holes that I'm going to use to connect a final piece of oak banding to the lower portion of this piece here. Basically I want that oak banding to conceal the plywood edge. I don't want to be able to tell that this is made out of plywood at all unless I take it off the wall. We start out by putting a small bead of glue where the plywood strong back is going to join the plywood shelf. Let me finish up by adding a small bead of glue where the strong back joins the corbels. I've put this clamp to make sure that this piece is fully seated all the way down before I put the screw in. Now I can remove the clamps, set this aside to dry while I cut the cap piece for this piece of plywood here. I'll start off by ripping this down to 7/8 of an inch wide. Although that number is pretty arbitrary, you can do this to whatever width you wanted. So what I want to do now is go ahead and cut this to the length. But before I do, I want to square up one end so that I can mark and be exact. I can take that square end and place it where it's going to go and put a pencil mark on the other side. And now I know exactly where to cut. And then of course, lastly, before I install this piece, I do want to put a decorative edge on the one lip just so that it matches the rest. So I'm going to use the same detailing bead that I've used before and put a 1/4 inch round over cove in this edge. This piece will be a little bit more challenging to get lined up properly. So I'm just going to go ahead and put it in place and clamp it, then flip it over and go ahead and screw it in with pocket screws. With the screw in, I can move the clamp down, align the next piece, and put a screw here as well. And that completes the construction of this hanging shelf with the closet rod. All that's left to do at this point is to paint it and install. This is one of those projects that I designed to get your wife on board with your woodworking hobby, because improving the laundry room should be a pretty easy sell for just about anybody. So until next time, this is Jason with Born Handy.